The Detroit Lions are continuing to make moves on their coaching staff, and the most recent move is that they have found their next pass game coordinator, and it sounds like Tanner Engstrand is going to be on his way out for the New York Jets. Richie's Jets, it sounds like that's where he's going, but the Detroit Lions decided to make their move to go get their next offensive coordinator, a guy with a massive track record. That's going to be David Shaw. So let's get right into it. So David Shaw is joining the Lions as their next passing game coordinator. Now, he's been kind of out of the coaching circle for the last few years, hasn't coached since 2022. Last season was with the Denver Broncos as a senior personnel assistant, and we saw the personnel they put together. Denver had a fantastic season working with rookie Bo Nix. This also carries over what John Morton was as well, who is now our offensive coordinator that was with Denver the past 2 seasons with Russell Wilson and Bo Nix, so there's an easy connection there. In terms of David Shaw, I think the biggest thing that stands out in the immediate reaction is the style of which he's coached quarterbacks back to the time that he was in the NFL when he was an NFL offensive coordinator back in the late 90s, working with guys like Rich Gannon. He's constantly worked with these pro-style types of quarterbacks. That's how his offenses has consistently looked. He's typically worked with quarterbacks and wide receivers positionally, been an offensive coordinator to start with Stanford, and then had an 11-year run with Stanford, or maybe that's 12 years, between 2011 and 2022. And during that time, I mean, he was racking up awards, 4-time Coach of the Year within his conference. He produced multiple quarterbacks that got into the NFL. A couple of those guys drafted, and if you just look at some of the names, they all make a ton of sense. KJ Costello, undrafted free agent, lands with the LA Chargers as an undrafted free agent. The things that stands out to me about KJ Costello, I remember him coming out, is that the final year of his collegiate career, he transferred to Mississippi State after a year of injuries, had a pretty horrible season, goes undrafted. It looked like he was going to get drafted at one point, and just 2 years before with David Shaw, he had his career season, 29 touchdowns, 11 interceptions just a couple of years before. You also have guys like Davis Mills that was with David Shaw, with Stanford for a few seasons, another pro-style quarterback, stays in the pocket. And if you even just look at David Shaw's offenses, there's a lot of the I formation. It's a lot of old school. They lean on tight ends. That was the school that had Dalton Schultz at the time. Thing that stands out to me that I do like, and we have to keep in mind, it's just going to be with the passing game coordinator. But when they did have fantastic running backs, the offense did shift into that style more. He's always wanted to run the football, and when they've had guys like Bryce Love, who were setting records at the time, the rushing game stats took over, and that's what they leaned on. But typically, it was a passing team that we had seen with Stanford. Of course, it all kind of jump-started with Andrew Luck in his final season, went on to have a career season in his final season after Harbaugh. There's a connection there as well. I mean, we think about the pro style, we think about wanting to run the football, having that identity, play action, quick passing game. Remember, we go back to when he was back at San Diego working under Jim Harbaugh. Connection-wise, there's a lot of connections here for the Lions, but there's also the stylistic connection that makes sense for Jared Goff and what the Lions are looking for. I remembered that I had listened to a podcast a couple of years ago, and I had notes that I had saved because David Shaw jumped on the podcast. It was a draft podcast at the time, and I thought some of the answers he gave were fantastic, and I was trying to compare it to what the Lions situation was at the time, and I think it was back in 2022 when the offense kind of took off, which is weird because I talked about that in John Morton as well when the offense took off. But in 2022, the Lions were trying to find their explosives and how they got explosive pass plays, and that was the conversation. And during that time, David Shaw hopped on a podcast, and one thing he brought up was like, yeah, well, what downfield routes can we throw? Because basically you create explosives in different ways. So he didn't want to think of things as like, let's put it in a box. This is how you create explosives. These are the routes that you could run. He was like, how do we create them? And that was one of my favorite quotes because I started to look at the Lions and what they have. And I think the Lions have done a great job of that. DJ Chark created verticals and explosive routes much differently than we've had from any other receiver to this point. So I think that mindset's great. And then I look at the David Shaw offense and I talk about that quick passing attack they utilized. You forget that guys like Tanner McKee, 6th-round pick for Philadelphia, all the read options, all the RPOs that they utilized. Then you get to a guy like Davis Mills, and they're not really using that as much. But the RPOs were so heavy because it was like, this is the centerpiece of the offense, and everything we'll do is create off of that. So you see the quick passing attack, you see getting the ball out fast, you see the deep curls, and I think that's what he's done a great job of. From my little experience having watching him, is that they've created their explosives to really what the quarterback's good at. And that's getting the ball out fast, that's the curl routes, that's setting things up over the middle, playing to their strengths really well, rather than kind of getting away from that. I think that's what helped McKee a ton, is that they were able to just kind of funnel everything through the run. Even if they weren't the best rushing team, everything came off of that, everything played off it, simplified reads. So I think that quote specifically means a lot. Kevin Hogan was also a draft pick that they developed. He had 75 touchdowns to 29 interceptions in his career. 66% of his passes in his career. So he had multiple guys come out as draft picks. I mean, he had Davis Mills, who was a third round pick, in a style that's going to fit what the Lions do offensively as well. So I can understand the connection here. David Shaw was very well respected. Then we got kind of into the personnel stuff. We got to see him on TV doing all the draft shows specifically. And for him just working with the passing game, I think this is a style fit. That's what Dan Campbell had said initially looking for his offensive coordinator. He said stylistically, this has to be good for Jared Goff. Like, this has to make him feel comfortable. And I think that that's exactly what they went after here. So academically, had more success than anybody in the nation in his tenure with Stanford as well. And again, if you go through the clips, it just kind of looks like what the Lions have dealt with also not having a ton of mobility at quarterback. That hasn't been what David Shaw has dealt with. When he's had it, you've seen, read option, you've seen it implemented, but it's typically been a power, multiple tight ends. Let's run the football, and we're going to set up off of that. So for me, I think the fit makes a ton of sense stylistically. On the flip side, you look at losing Tanner Engstrand and what he did over the past season. It was such a weird situation with Engstrand when he initially became our just pass game coordinator, because that's what he was. Then the Lions went out, brought in Steve Hyden, and then he dropped the title of tight end coach. Then he's just a pass game coordinator. But then the next guy I think for offensive coordinator was kind of probably going to be Tanner Engstrand, because it was a very similar path on paper to Ben Johnson. Obviously, that's not the case. Sounds like he's going to go to the Jets for that exact same role. But clearly, the Lions are kind of getting ahead of this. It doesn't seem like Tanner Engstrand's probably going to be back. He would have to completely change his title, so I doubt that that's going to happen. His vision is going to be very similar to what Dan Campbell, what he wants it to look like. And I don't think we should overlook that, because Dan Campbell did tell us when he was searching for the offensive coordinator, this is my responsibility to figure out who the next guy is. I'm the offensive guy. You think about all these other coaches, we all put ties to him. They're the offensive coach. He calls plays. Dan kind of falls in the middle, it feels like, but he is an offensive guy with an offensive background that played tight end, that coached tight ends, and he feels like for him, I mean, even if you go back when he was with Miami, when he was with Miami, he ended up firing the offensive coordinator because he didn't feel like he was running enough. So Dan's always had that heavy hand in kind of what they've done offensively, and the vision that they're trying to lay out here is definitely in the vision of Dan Campbell. So for me, early thoughts, I think this fits. I think it makes sense stylistically. So I think all that checks out. And then when you look at the passing stats, typically they were in the top half of the country over the last handful of years that he was with Stanford, in the top 20 a few times. Usually the run game took a massive step back, and that's not what they leaned on. And then by the time he got to his final season, they went 3-9. He decided to resign, stepped away, came back in 2024. And now it looks like he's ready to get back at it with Dan Campbell. So I think this is just collaboration of guys that have the same vision. They want it to look similar, and they have the same kind of idea of how the game's going to be played, and it led to a lot of consistency with Shaw, and it led to developing NFL-style quarterbacks. You get a lot of quarterbacks that put up numbers in college, but he constantly put guys in the NFL over and over and over with 3-star recruits, 4-star recruits, and even 5-star recruits. So I'm excited for the style fit here. I hate that we're losing Tanner Engstrand. We'll probably revisit this at some point, because I do want to take a deeper dive at what he's going to bring to the table. Same thing with John Morton, but I think the connection's there, and it just makes sense. So appreciate y'all joining. I'll see you guys at some point next week. We also may have some Senior Bowl talk a little bit as well, because day 3 is now in the books. We have to get into that. And then for the Senior Bowl game, I'm expecting we're going to do some sort of live stream, some kind of watch party for it, something along those lines, because I definitely want to revisit this, and it feels like we built out a foundation here.